1942 with the arrival of the 53rd Battalion from New South Wales and the 39th Battalion from Victoria. For the 39th, it was the beginning of a date with destiny. Raised in September 1941 under Lieutenant Colonel Owen, the 39th, like the 53rd, embarked with only basic training complete. Both battalions joined the 49th in doing everything but training for war. Bill Guest was a sergeant with A Company, 39 Battalion.
But when we got off the Aquitania, nobody knew we were coming, which was sort of went along with things that happened in those days. And we marched 7 miles out to Jackson's airstrip, which was nothing but this near.
So you can imagine how antique the weapons were that we went away with. We never got Tommy guns until somewhere in about the April of 1942. And when we went over the Owen Stanleys, we went with the Louis guns and the rifle, the 303 rifle.
The chaos brought about by the bombing of Port Moresby on the 3rd and 5th of February, the first of many, showed how vulnerable the garrison was to large-scale invasion. Rabaul in New Britain had fallen to a massive Japanese onslaught only a week before. All those
and I don't know what time, it was early January, I forget now, when we arrived in Port Moresby, and the training was zilch. We were more or less unloading boats and used for duties around there, you know. And purely as companies, we weren't as a battalion. We didn't know anybody else in the battalion. We only knew that your own people in that company, and that went on for a long time. Right up until we went on to the trial, then we started to meet some of the rest of the battalion, and later on in the war, after we were over at the Battle of the Beaches, you know, going rebuke, well, we sort of knew they were coming.
The new brigade commander, Brigadier Porter, was able to secure an influx of experienced AIF officers returned from the Middle East. Thus began the belated job of not only training, but lifting the by now low morale of the brigade.
In the future to us, we had the old Lewis guns, which had seen service during the First World War, 303 rifles, grenades, 36M grenades, and bayonets, that was it. No heavy machine guns or anything like that. Oh, the submachine gun was the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, because up to then the Owens hadn't appeared to us.
On the 26th of June 1942, B Company, Officer Commanding Captain Sam Templeton, set off with his company of only partially trained soldiers, supported by a detachment of the Pacific Islands Battalion. A body of young soldiers, average age 18.5 years, who would shortly come face to face with the best trained and equipped jungle fighters.
And they called us up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon to issue rations to us. And we said, what are we going to put them in? And they said, oh, get your mosquito nets, tear the bottom off the mosquito nets and wrap it up in that. And we wrapped our tea up in one portion, the sugar in another, salt in another. And of course, no time they're sopping wet. We stuffed them in our packs. And off we went, never knowing what it was going to be like. Didn't have a clue. Nobody told us anything.
You know, khaki clothes, remember?
No, yeah,
and they got green bloody dye,
yeah.
And we dyed our clothes, and as soon as you got wet, all the dye ran out.
They were like Biola, wasn't it?
You had heliotrope sort of clothes, plus a big string of pimples all over your legs into the bargain, where the dye affected your skin in some cases.
That's right.
I mean, that
was at Biola we
today walking around these beautiful camouflage suits and everything, you'd have given your life.
Yeah.
Well, probably some poor souls did, for lack of that, but you'd have given anything to get something like that. And the lack of...
Native carriers, commanded by Captain Kensel, a rubber planter before the war, gave invaluable assistance to the Australians. But the young soldiers still had to struggle with 30-kilo packs of equipment through rain-drenched jungle.
We had native carriers to carry the gear, but of course the troops they weren't really conditioned, although they'd been digging a lot around Port Moresby. And they took it pretty easily. It took about 6 days to get across and out of rest day. But when we got to a place called Ura Creek, which was only about 3 days off or 2 days walk from Deniki, which overlooked the Kokoda, was then that the Bren guns caught up, and The night before we took off from there, the Bren Lewis gunners were called in to hand in their Lewis guns, and they were issued a Bren gun still in their grease, and that's the way they carried them into action. Still the grease up the barrel. Huh? And the rations, of course, were getting scarcer, the food getting scarcer as you went across there because of the paucity of carriers. They have a very big carrier problem. There's no aircraft around to do any drops in any case. There's nowhere to drop it because the Japanese owned Kokoda at that stage. They were in occupation of it.
But eventually, when you came to the top, you then had to go down, and you went down, 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 and the weight on your back and the motion of your legs, you just couldn't stop them. You just ran, and the thing was you couldn't pull yourself up at all. You just went on and on and on till you hit the bottom or stood over on your tail.
And we fought for a couple of hours there, and we were really surrounded. In trouble. We had no hope of getting out. And you might remember I told you about Sinopa, the police boy. He found a way to get us out, and we were fortunate enough that the 80 troops that were there were able to get away without any casualties.
Right.
You must remember, though, that every time we were
days
surrounded...
after the loss of Kokoda, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honour took command of the 39 Battalion. A veteran of the 6th Division, he'd seen service in the Middle East and would quickly establish a relationship with his men which would endure to this day. A crucial factor which worked against the Australians in the early days of the campaign was that of resupply. Poor staff work resulted in chaos at supply depots. Airdrops often went astray, or were gathered in by the Japanese, or were damaged when they did reach the troops.
You remember strange things that happened. 40,000 rations.
Yeah.
It was all in plane loads of them. They left Moresby, they disappeared. They were
Like
a mile
Myola.
awaiting us to get there.
Yeah.
When we got there was nothing. There was no, and nobody ever found out what happened to those rations, whether it was an administrative bungle, and Potts went mad, everybody went mad, but nothing ever happened. And we still had no rations, and they said, you will stay here till you get them. And then the word filtered back down the track, the 14th are committed, they're in trouble, you've got to get going, get straight up there and get in with them. And the blokes were anxious to go, but we still had no rations.
Most of the supplies that we've landed
One
on
night,
target were...
used lanterns in full view of the Australians to move into a forming up position ready for battle the next day.
Our battalion, having done this forced march, had virtually barely got their breath back, and they were told to dig in because the Japs were coming down the opposite side of the valley and they could possibly launch an attack even that day. But the attack didn't eventuate that day. The two forward companies of